And we're going to go into our last session now, which is hopefully going to just continue pulling together all the different strands and themes that we have been reflecting on together. Unbelievable data, information, inspiration, content to process. And we're now going to move on to another way in which so many of these concepts and principles are being practically implemented and facilitated in contemporary Reform Judaism on the ground, with a discussion of the new revision of the Sinai Union Prayer Book, its role in the continuum of our Reform tradition, and its very personal meaning as a resource for the continuing richness and the continuing development of our spiritual lives. We're going to begin with Alec Harris, who will be moderating. In a sense, he will be sharing a very personal perspective about how the new generation of young people who have been brought into our community through the message of the historic Reform tradition, how he envisions and how he has experienced the message of classical reform and the impact of the Sinai Union Prayer Book. And I'm going to hand the mic over to Alec. Alec, I'd like you to also share your credentials, not only in terms of being a supporter of the Society, being a member of the Board of Overseers of HUC Cincinnati campus, and your other involvements through Sinai in Chicago. And if you want to either wear that or just hold this, whatever you do.
You don't need to put it close.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Howard. So, I am, when my mother was a Holocaust survivor, is a Holocaust survivor. She was a hidden child during the war and was very conflicted with religion. So when I was growing up, I really had to do most of the exploring myself with a little bit of support from my grandfather. And so it's pretty fair to say I was very peripherally engaged in any kind of organized Judaism. I went to religious school, that was about it. And then I pretty much became, in college, and then right after college, what I would consider a high holy days Jew. I had a very, I think, a misinformed idea of what Reform Judaism was, which was, I thought it was kind of Judaism light. And I think one of the sad things is so many people out there who are part of Reform congregations feel that it's Judaism light, and I think it's something that I wrestle with, and when I speak to people, when I engage with them on it, it is, of course, very deeply rooted in intellectual rigor, and the more I learn about the Reform movement and classical Reform, the more rich it is. What I found is what propelled me to Jewish leadership is actually being in an interfaith relationship. My wife, Carolina, she is Korean American. She was born here in the United States. And when we started having a significant relationship, we wrestled with how we wanted to raise our children. And through that dialogue, we realized we wanted to have them be Jewish. We wanted them to be identified as Jewish. And so Carolina, my wife, said she was totally fine with that. That meant that I had to take some responsibility because she wouldn't know where to start. She grew up more or less evangelical Christian. So that propelled me to get engaged, to think about it, and we became aware from some of our friends who were part of an outreach program at Chicago Sinai Congregation. My first reaction was, what a sharing group of interfaith families just seemed a little bit strange. But I went and I met Rabbi Berman, And I found it to be incredibly enriching. And I think Rabbi Berman said some things that were very compelling to me right from the very beginning, which was that he was really what he wanted to do is he wanted to engage me Jewishly in a deep way. And it propelled me. And I think that there were a lot of things about Sinai and about classical reform that were particularly compelling to me and to all of kind of my contemporaries at Sinai. One was, of course, it was fully welcoming of us as an interfaith family. We weren't separated out. We were fully integrated and welcomed to everything that we wanted to do in our congregation. The second thing is, of course, we had a deep commitment to social justice and social action. And it was more than just lip service, working in a soup kitchen and then working for advocacy and those in a very deep and rich way, and understanding the importance of social justice to the reform movement was a key to my own personal engagement at Sinai. But really, ultimately, it was the liturgy that got me. It was the fact that I was able to understand the words of the prayer book. I was able to integrate them, and it was kind of a jumping off point to a deeper and more rich understanding of what Judaism was and what it could be, because I could understand the words. I'm not fluent in Hebrew. It's very minimal for me. Not only was I able to dive in through that, but also I was able to, my wife was able to enter into Judaism in a very rich and meaningful way through the texts of the prayer book. So that's one of the reasons I'm particularly excited about this session, to learn a little bit more. But that kind of jumped off for me. I've been, of course, I've gone on to become Social Action Chair at Sinai, President of Sinai. And then I was lucky enough to be part of what's called the Wexner Heritage Program, which is a group of lay leaders development program. It's a 2-year program of folks across denominational lines. And one of the main takeaways from that was I had no more or less Jewish knowledge than even the most Orthodox people in the room. Most Jewish adults, unfortunately, their Jewish education stops with their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. And how you encounter Judaism as an adult is a whole different thing. And I think that, again, this is another major challenge. So I've gone on to be honored to be part of the HUC overseers here in Cincinnati. I'm part of the URJ National Board now as well, working to integrate and connect the two incredible institutions. And really, I can stand here and say that I wouldn't be here today if I wasn't in an interfaith relationship. And I think all of us need to take that in mind as we try to welcome interfaith families into our congregations. Okay, so it's my pleasure to be here, and I want to, of course, introduce Rabbi Berman, who needs no introduction as the chair of the Society for Classical Reform Judaism, the person who married me, and very proud to be here. And also Rick Sarason, who, of course, is the someone who I've come to think of as a friend, and also the professor of Rabbinic Literature and Thought, and associate editor of the HUC College Annual. So with that, we'll turn it over.
Those copies, by the way, were gifts from the Society to the Hebrew Union College, to our Beit Knesset, and we urge you at the end of the session to put them back on the carts, because they came from our synagogue, and they will go back to our synagogue. If you do not yet own your own copies and you wish to own copies, speak to Rabbi Berman, please, but do not take these copies. I would point out as well that the Society made a gift of copies of this prayer book this past fall to every student at the college. And we are very, very grateful to Rabbi Berman and to the Society for this gift. We use this prayer book among our various prayer books in the Beit Knesset. You also should have 2 handouts. One is the copy of a syllabus of a course that I have been giving every other year here for the past 6 years, which is a course on Reformed prayer books. And in fact, you will see that this symposium is part of that course. And indeed, the 3 people who are taking that course this semester are here as part of a requirement for that course. And the other handout deals with changing styles of union prayer books. Okay. One of the things that Rabbi Berman has, and I should point out, by the way, that Rabbi Berman and I are classmates. We both graduated, were ordained at HUC in the same year, 1974, and Rabbi Gary Walter is another one of our classmates, and Rabbi Ken Ehrlich is another one of our classmates.
The largest class in the history?
The largest class in the history of the college ordination class, though we were tied once in the early 2000s, or maybe surpassed by one, but we won't go there now. All right. One of the things that Rabbi Berman has been emphasizing is that the society is not simply about the preservation of the classical Reform heritage as some kind of museum piece, but the furtherance of the basic goals, ideas, and some of the aesthetic and liturgical preferences of the earlier Reform heritage into the contemporary world. There is a very well-known saying of Leonard Fine that was a title of a study from the 1970s. Reform is a verb, okay? It's not reformed Judaism, right? It's reform, which means, as we've seen all throughout this conference, that reform is responsive to changes in culture, in academic knowledge, and that the liturgies and the prayer books of the Reform movement express that fact. One of the things that I was remarking on for myself in my colleague David Aaron's presentation is the fact that the Reform movement has always thought historically, certainly, and certainly the Hegelian impact of, that is to say, the present, as it were, the present moment is very close to God. That is to say, the Spirit of God revealing itself through the forms of history. The only problem with that, in terms of privileging the present, is that it sometimes over-privileges the present. That is to say, it is not sometimes sufficiently critical of the present as a cultural moment. And it seems to me that, first of all, we as Jews, who are both inside or outsiders at a certain level of certainly of contemporary American culture, need to retain that position of cultural critics. That is to say, we shouldn't be deifying contemporary culture or, today's 15 minutes of fame or what have you. We should retain our stance as cultural critics. I think that is in some measure in keeping certainly with the intellectual heritage of Reform Judaism. even though sometimes in practice, historically, Reform Judaism has sometimes tended to deify the present and the present moment and aspects of contemporary culture. The moment of skepticism that Dr. Aaron referred to very early on in his talk is extreme, and also that Rabbi Sussman referred, is very, very important. Very important. As I say, I think one of our roles as Jews, certainly, and it's part of the prophetic role, has to be as cultural gadflies. It ain't necessarily so, I think is often a good refrain for us, as long as that is applied critically and thoughtfully. I say that as a way of introducing this prayer book, UPB Sinai Revised, together with its predecessor, UPB Sinai. The first from 2001, when it was published, and the second from this past year, 2012, being cognizant of the fact that the processes that generated these books obviously go back some years from the time that they were actually published. What is interesting about both of these books is that the idea of updating the Union Prayer Book, which was last revised in the late 1930s, Volume 1 was published in 1940, Volume 2 in 1945, basically it was the war and rationing of paper that dictated that 5-year gap. Updating the Union Prayer Book in the late 1990s, and again in about a decade later, meant, and continues to mean, responding to many of the same cultural pressures that in fact generated Gates of Prayer and generated Mishkan Tefillah. That is to say, wherever one situates oneself on the Reform spectrum, there are certain cultural ferments, certain social changes in American society and in the context of world Jewry that one needs to respond to. It's always important when you're looking at a prayer book, if the editors have in fact written introductions or prefaces, you have to read them to understand what the editors themselves thought they were doing in the prayer book. So obviously, thing number one is the watersheds in American Jewish life post-1940, specifically the Second World War, the results of the Second World War, the Holocaust, the creation of the State of Israel, and the way in which these things played out in American Jewish cultural context over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So, Gates of Prayer, Mishkan Tefillah, UPB Sinai, all respond to the realities of a post-Holocaust and present State of Israel world. The social and cultural ferment in American society in the 1960s and 70s, some of the pushbacks in the 80s and subsequently, are all responded to in these prayer books. That is to say, the notion of American culture as pluralistic rather than as a melting pot, in which you have a number of hyphenated American identities. The feminist movement, its critique of gendered God language, its critique of hierarchies, God as ruler, God as king, becomes in this prayer book God as creator. Think of Mishkan Tefillah, from Malkeinu to Shomreinu, right? It's our king, our preserver. It's the same cultural move. The concern for inclusiveness that Alec mentioned at the outset, the inclusion of women, the inclusion of GLBTQs, the inclusion of non-Jews and of intermarried Jews. The big tent, if you will. How does that affect your liturgical language? How do you represent the people in the congregation? How do you represent ideas of God? These are issues that all of the prayer books from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and subsequently address. The affirmation of the Jewish collectivity. We talked a little bit about this last night with Einhorn. The affirmation of Jewish identity and the positive value of Jewish collectivity, while nonetheless expressing concern for humanity as a whole. Particularism, individualism, particularism, universalism. How do you balance these concerns so that they are certainly not viewed as mutually exclusive, and so that they complement each other? In terms of the language of prayer, in the newest iteration of UPB Sinai, there are full transliterations of every single Hebrew text in the book. That was not true in the earlier edition. Only selected, the most popularly used texts were transliterated. In the new edition, everything is transliterated. And quite frankly, that reflects certain thoughts about transliteration in the movement as a whole, and sort of development of transliteration in prayer books between the 70s and the 2000s. Gates of Prayer did not do full transliterations, and it put transliterations at the back of the book. The gender-inclusive Gates of Prayer from the 90s put the transliterations sort of back where they belong, but again, didn't transliterate everything. Mishkan Tefillah transliterates everything on the spot. So again, what we're looking at here, these are larger trends in the Reform movement as a whole that are reflected in all of the liturgies of the Reform movement, and they should be reflected as well, obviously, and are, in any updating of the Union Prayer Book that wants to work with that text. Similarly, the issue of the literary English, the literary style of the English. English is very important in the Union Prayer Book, as Alec was referring to. English is very important in the newest iterations of that, because for people who are not fluent in Hebrew, you have to be able to pray in the language that you know, right? Prayer is prayer, and prayer has to speak to the heart and has to voice our highest aspirations. So English language prayer for English language speakers is hugely important. That's true, on the one hand, throughout the entire Reform movement. It is particularly true for a revision of this sort of the Union Prayer Book. But it is also true, and this is interesting, as early as the first version of UPB Sinai, that there is a recognition that, if you will, the King James Anglican English, which simply was the style of liturgy in the United States in the 19th and early 20th century, the style essentially of the King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. Those are the models. And that is what is reflected in all of the editions of the Union Prayer Book. that is no longer appropriate, even for people who want to retain the style of the Union Prayer Book. So that what you have in these books, and the style does change from the first edition to the second edition, is a balancing, if you will, of the rhetoric, the literate rhetoric of the Union Prayer Book, with a desire for not colloquial, but more contemporary English language. A contemporization, if you will, of the language, while still attempting to preserve the literary cadences of the Union Prayer Book. And that level of literary artistry, of aesthetic appreciation of language and the value of language as the vehicle through which our prayers rise is extremely important in this book. And frankly, I, as a liturgist, view language and music, actually, as very, very critical to the worship and the prayer experience. This is not, your father's Union Prayer Book or even your Union Prayer Book at a certain level, because it does include additional material. Not only additional material that was created specifically for these books, but additional material that in fact is taken over from Gates of Prayer, in the same way that Mishkan Tefillah takes over some materials from Gates of Prayer. That is to say, there is an openness here, truth wherever it be found, right? That is to say, effective prayer language, whatever Reformed prayer book it comes from, whether it comes from the Union Prayer Book, whether it comes from Gates of Prayer, whether it comes from something else. And in that respect, this book also reflects the wide tent of Reform and the recognition that all of this, if you will, is fair game for a prayer book. There are more alternative and creative readings in this book, and actually the number of alternative readings increases in the revised edition, which is not surprising, because if you look at the history of the Union Prayer Book, that's also what happened across the several editions of the Union Prayer Book as well. Another thing that is found, I would say, among all the prayer books, by the way, across the movements in the past 30 years or so, is a concern for aesthetic presentation. What does the physical book actually look like? How is the text laid out on the page? What kind of artwork or illustration or line drawings do you include in the book? In both of the editions of UPB Sinai, there are color plates. In the first edition, at the very front, you have a color plate of the stained glass windows from Temple Sinai in Chicago, which is, of course, also an expression of the identity of the prayer book and of the group that presented the prayer book, right? That is somewhat broadened in the newest edition, where you have color plates of photography, pictures of the sanctuaries of the historic, many of, not all of, but many of the historic Reformed congregations in North America, interspersed throughout the text. So that, on the one hand, there's a message being given there, but there's also something of aesthetic value. Interestingly enough, one of the differences between the earlier edition of UPB Sinai and the later edition has to do with the way in which text is parsed on the page. There is much more attention, and Alec will be, as a publisher, will be aware of this, much more attention to representing visually on the page the rhetoric and also the performative rhetoric of the text, as opposed to, if you will, blocks of text. That paragraphs often are broken up into their rhetorical portions, and certainly psalm texts or texts that have certain literary structures are broken up so that you sense on the page the rhetoric of the text. And this is something, quite frankly, that I advocate for in all prayer books. Prayer is poetry. Prayer is poetry. Certainly Hebrew prayer is poetry. And if one is talking about prayer cadences, the extent to which those can be depicted visually on the page, whether it involves an alternation of voices or simply an alternation of thoughts. Very, very important. And contributes, I think, to the overall success of the worship experience as an aesthetic experience. Obviously, the emphasis on social justice in the footsteps of the Hebrew prophets. We talked about this throughout the weekend. A very important piece of the ideology of this book. But interestingly enough, if you look through the new materials in Mishkan Tefillah, it's there too. It's there too. In other words, that's one of the themes that they wanted to raise as well. So this is part of the shared Reform heritage across the spectrum. What is distinctive, I would say, about this book and the way in which it does carry forward and intends to carry forward the heritage of the Union Prayer Book is that it obviously preserves, with updating, many of the classic English passages of the Union Prayer Book. That is to say, those texts and prayers that have become familiar and that are, frankly, very well appreciated and, by some people, beloved. Texts that are, if it works, don't kill it, right? If a text is effective, then preserve it, right? It's not change for the sake of change in that respect. Similarly, preserving the style of responsive reading, that is to say, how does one engage congregation so that it's not just a voice coming from the pulpit, right? Alternation of voices, and again, how do you deal with English text, and particularly longer English text? Preserving a style of responsive reading or alternating longer paragraphs, reader, congregation. And interestingly enough, while there are more, shall we say, stage directions in the original UPB Sinai, there are fewer in the revised edition, where instead the alternating voices are indicated simply by how you place the text on the page. Use of italics, use of spacing, etc., etc., etc. And that, too, in some measure, reflects trends in the larger Reform movement for how you indicate or how you allow for different kinds of performances of text on pages. Once again, this preserves the style of the Union Prayer Book in that, again, following Einhorn, what you have are the integration of Hebrew and English on the same page, as opposed to facing pages of English and Hebrew. That's the Einhorn style. Much of the English is a paraphrase of the Hebrew rather than a so-called faithful translation. And that, too, preserves the Union Prayer Book and the Einhorn style, and also, by the way, the Geiger style, where the vernacular was more often than not a paraphrase of the Hebrew, which reflected the ideology of and the more contemporary thinking of or interpretation of the author-editors, rather than a faithful translation of the Hebrew. The book obviously is linear, that is to say, the pages flow from, and the book also still opens from left to right. There is more Hebrew in UPB Sinai than there was in UPB. And there is more Hebrew consistently in UPB Sinai Revised than there was in the original UPB Sinai. There are certain texts that are structurally basic to the traditional service and to the Reformed service that are represented throughout, for example, in all 5 of the evening Shabbat evening services, in Hebrew and English, rather than, as was the case in the original UPB and also was the case in the first Sinai, where in your alternatives, sometimes you had Hebrew, sometimes you didn't. Here, it's all there, and it's all transliterated as well. As the preface points out, where certain things have become sort of standard Reformed texts now, like, okay, so we brought back Hatzi Kaddish, so this book does too. It's there as an option. If you want it, it's there. If you don't want it, you don't have to do it. But it's there. Aleinu and Adoration. You now have a Hebrew option there, which you didn't in UPB. So once again, this represents the fact that this book remains very much in the mainstream of contemporary Reformed prayer books in that respect, in terms of what it has reintegrated and taken up and added to the 1940 UPB, while preserving those characteristics and texts, English texts, from the UPB that remain salient. The other thing that is characteristic of this book, and in which it differs from some of the tendencies in Gates of Prayer, and certainly in Mishkan Tefillah, is that it maintains, like the Union Prayer Book, the relative brevity of the service. That is to say, those portions of the service before Baruch Hu, which historically in most of the North American Reform prayer books were heavily abbreviated, remain heavily abbreviated. That in that way it differs from Mishkan Tefillah, where more of that stuff is put back in, so that you can go on for 20 minutes before you get to Baruch Hu, right? And as well as the selective inclusion of traditional materials. In that respect, again, it follows more on the style of the Union Prayer Book. It is worth, by the way, pointing out that the Union Prayer Book, the original Union Prayer Book, remained very much throughout all of its permutations a traditional Jewish prayer book in terms of its structure. It remained very much within the fold of the traditional liturgy in terms of retaining the basic rubrics of the traditional liturgy, and of eliminating or of heavily abbreviating the ones that were somewhat more secondary in terms of their history and tradition. But the book was always identifiable as Jewish in that regard within the mainstream of Jewish liturgy. Another thing that is interesting about this book is that its texts for musical rendition are eclectic. That is to say, they draw from the tradition, they draw from the Union hymnal, that is to say, the English translations that appear in the 1940 UPB that also appeared in the 1932 Union Hymnal. But they also include more contemporary musical pieces like some of Debbie Friedman's things, Misha Berach, etc., that have sort of become, standard in most Reform congregations. What you can never tell from a prayer book, and remember, a prayer book is not a service. A prayer book is a script. Any prayer book, however well-crafted it is, can be scuttled by a poor performance, or on the other hand, can be enhanced by a good performance. So what you can't tell from the prayer book itself is, all right, so how is this text being performed? And what's the musical style here? That is to say, what musical compositions are being drawn on? Clearly the intent, from what Howard has spoken about, from what people have written about, is that the musical culture of the prayer book is also very inclusive and draws on, if you will, many different styles and periods of North American Reformed liturgy in this respect. As I think it was you or someone was saying yesterday, going from organ to guitar in that regard. So that again, the intent is to be inclusive, not to shut something out because it's older. The theological style and rhetoric of the book, in contrast to certain other things that have appeared in the Reform movement more recently, is not, shall we say, ecstatic, or pop, or heavily individualistic, or postmodern in terms of ironic overtones. This is a very non-ironic prayer book. It's modern, it's not postmodern in that sense. It's not about personal quest, if you will, at the expense of communal identity. It is not countercultural in the sense that it still earnestly extols middle-class values and piety, which is what you have in the 19th and early 20th century Reform movement and in the Union Prayer Book. And also the literary style does not feel clipped. There are no sound bites in this book. The aim is not brevity, though it's obviously not intended to be prolix. And if you take a look historically at some of these texts from the older Union Prayer Books, some of them are indeed reduced. But the idea here is clearly contemporary eloquence that still has a kind of a classic resonance. The language is contemporary but elevated at the same time. And obviously, as we have been talking about all weekend, this is a prayer book that values the head, that is to say, the intellect and reason, as well as the heart, emotion, and attempts to balance the two. It rejects what we might call the romantic reaction of the 60s counterculture that wanted to throw out, if you will, intellectualism and simply go with intuition, simply go with emotiveness. And we're still fighting those battles, very much so in contemporary American culture. We're fighting them in the academy. We're fighting them in the pews. So the idea here is that head and heart should go together. This is not just about heart, and it is not just about head. And interestingly enough, by the way, if you look very carefully at the writings of some of the 19th century leaders of Reform Judaism, including, by the way, Kaufman Kohler, it never was just about the head. Kohler is very, very vigorous in his writing about the need for liturgy that inspires and that moves people and that that appeals to people's emotions as a way of motivating them to do what, to embody these ideals of the movement. So once again, as Rabbi Sussman was saying yesterday, these 19th and early 20th century figures are much more complex than they are sometimes caricatured or depicted as being in these sound bites that to some extent reflect more of the contemporary cultural conflicts. In the newest edition of Sinai Revised, there is avoidance of language or imagery that suggests that God authored the Torah. Much more of a reflection in this regard of some of the things that Dr. Aaron was talking about. There is also an avoidance of anthropomorphic imagery and divine interventionist language. And then, again, that's new in the more recent edition. So, for example, if you compare the two editions of UPB Sinai, the text, "As you have redeemed Israel and saved us," as opposed to saved him, right? "From arms stronger than our own, so may you redeem all who are oppressed and persecuted." You'll recognize that from the Union Prayer Book. That becomes, in the new edition, "As you have enabled our people, Israel, to prevail over arms stronger than our own." Okay? There's no divine intervention anymore. It's more about enabling, right? "So may you give hope," not redeem, "give hope to all who are oppressed and persecuted." That is a distinctively theological move. "Help us to find meaning and hope. Whether our petitions are granted or denied becomes help us to find meaning and hope in times of joy and also in times of distress." Again, that's a theological shift. The expression "clinging to your commandments" becomes holding fast to our cherished ideals. "O God, you give meaning to our hopes" becomes, "O God, help us to find meaning in our hopes." These are examples of some of these theological shifts. And similarly, there is an affirmation here of the mission of Israel, a la Einhorn, without at the same time being the chosen people, a la Kaplan, right? The Friday night format is very similar to that of the Union Prayer Book. That is to say, there is no Kabbalat Shabbat, a long series of opening psalms. You rather, like the 1940 UPB, have a number of opening hymns or songs from which you choose, and one of them is L'Chadodi. But instead of interspersing these throughout the 5 services, as you have in the UPB 1940, they're all gathered at the front, like in Mishkan Tefillah. A few other things that have changed that are interesting between the 2000 original and the 2012 revision, and I'll just tick these off and then turn the floor over to Howard. The Kiddush is moved from a home ritual at the back of the book to the front of the book, just like Mishkan Tefillah. And it is now together with prayers of healing, Debbie Friedman's Mishaberach, that is to say, things for inclusion in the service, but options at the front of the service in terms of where you do this during the service. We talked about the layout issues. The page breathes better in the new edition, and also the Chatimot are singled out, which is interesting because that's also the technique of Mishkan Tefillah. Each of the 4 alternative services for Erev Shabbat is now clearly demarcated with a title page. So, there were things that were done in terms of the revision for purposes of clarity. clearly. As I mentioned before, the abandonment of reading rubrics, who does what, and more thorough use of alternating type fonts. That was the technique of Gates of Prayer. There is now, in each of these 4 services, a creative option for V'ahavta, besides the translation of the Hebrew text. And that Hebrew text, of course, is transliterated. All, as I mentioned before, all Erev Shabbat services, all 4 of them, are now formally equivalent in their use of Hebrew. They all include Avat Olam, the second bracha of Kriyat Shema, eternal is your love for us. They all include Hashkivenu, cause us to lie down in peace. They all include Vishamru or Yismachu as alternatives, as appears in Gates of Prayer and Mishkan Tefillah. They all include in the Amida Adonai Sfatai Tiftach, which is the verse from Psalms that precedes the traditional Amida. Why? Because, again, that sort of entered into Reform culture through singing it. You also have, in addition to Avot Gevurot, and you also have Kedushat Hayom and Hoda'ah, the Thanksgiving benediction, the benediction for the day. These are all given as Hebrew options in every single service. There are changes in some of the English options in the new. You're given more choices, again, there are things that appear in Gates of Prayer and Mishkan Tefillah that originated that were written by various Reform rabbis. There are texts by David Polish. There are texts by Harvey Fields and Chaim Stern. Interestingly enough, in Service 4, as the English version of the Thanksgiving prayer, you have this reading for the expanding grandeur of the universe, worlds within worlds, which appears in Mishkan Tefillah, and was actually written, as it turns out, by O. Eugene Pickett, who was the head of the Unitarian Universalist movement at one time. But this is taken over into both of these Reform prayer books. You now have Aleinu, the adoration, instead of simply adoration. So you've got more Hebrew. You've got Kaddish with contemporary pronunciation before the Ashkenazic pronunciation, recognizing that there are people in congregations who know and prefer both ways of reciting Kaddish in that respect. So the point of all this is simply that this is a concrete demonstration of exactly what Rabbi Berman has been saying about the way in which the classical Reform heritage can be contemporary and can play out liturgically in a contemporary format. All of these books obviously can be used in any way that you choose, and the service leader has a great deal of latitude with any prayer book in terms of what the service is actually going to feel like. Your choice of music, your choice of language, your choice of how you articulate prayers and how you do things with the congregation. These are not functions of the prayer book. These are functions of leading a service and constructing a service. But to conclude, what is noteworthy, as I say, about this book is that this is a mainstream Reform book. This is a mainstream Reform option. And should be recognized and acknowledged as such. There are many lovely texts in this book, and it is a book that can be used with great conviction and great pride. So let me turn over the floor now to Rabbi Berman, who deservedly should have the final word.
And this will be the final word. We are coming to, Rick, I think I'll take.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Just a few closing observations I'd like to make. Try and pull all this together as we conclude the conference. One thing just to point out, Rick referred to the fact of how important it was to us in producing this book to have the look and the feel of the historic Union Prayer Book. Because such a key part of the Society's value is that the classical Reform tradition is an enduring minhag with its own distinctive culture.
You're going to pull that off the
What?
paper. Just put it on your belt or your
Okay.
Sorry.
With its own distinctive culture, its own distinctive music. We know that many, many people over the generations came to know and love just even the look, the blue cover, the red ribbon, the deckled edges. And Alec Harris, who is the publisher of our book, the printer of our book, did a beautiful job in recreating that wonderful tradition and style. And the photographs were consciously a part, carried over from the 2000 edition, of renewing really a very old tradition in Jewish life, of the illuminated prayer books that go back to the medieval period, where the Siddur was an object of beauty. Unlike the Torah scroll, which could not be illustrated, the prayer book was a vehicle for artistic creativity. And by including photographs of historic Reform synagogues here in America, we wanted to draw the sense of continuing tradition, continuing legacy. Every one of these pictures was meant to emphasize the play of light, color, and shadow as an expression of a spiritual value, which is reflected, we hope, in many of the prayers. I want to just give voice to one dissenting comment of something that Rick just mentioned. We do not see this as the embodiment of middle class values. We see this as the embodiment of the prophetic traditions of our people. And we use our historic texts of our Union Prayer Book tradition to drive that point home. Let me just point out two to you that I'd like you to share and take a look at. On page 65 in the Shabbat Evening Service 3, which is Service 3 in both the 1940 UPB, the 2000 Sinai, and the 2012 Sinai. Service number 3 is the quintessential classical Reform service that expresses the great social justice tradition. So that reading on page 65, which is taken over from the original UPB, we feel is one of the most beautiful expressions of that value. May the righteous of all nations rejoice in God's love. Let them beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. You shall not hate your brother or your sister. The stranger that sojourns with you shall be accepted as your equal. Why do you crush my people and oppress the poor? Asks God. The Eternal One defends the poor and upholds the rights of the needy. That, in turn, is an echo from page 61, one of the great original UPB texts which many of us so love and which was formative in our upbringing. When justice burns like a flaming fire within us, when love evokes willing sacrifice from us, when to the last full measure of selfless devotion we proclaim our belief in the ultimate triumph of truth and righteousness, we are truly doing your will. That text alone was one of the texts that inspired me at the age of 6 to become a rabbi. Just hearing those words regularly in my own upbringing. And finally, there are two things among many, there's two that make this book unique. In our prayers for special occasions, which begins around page 200, we have prayers for all the key moments, whether Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaShoah, the various holy days and holidays and festivals. We have a special section beginning on page 206, prayers for American holidays. And we are the first prayer book, I believe, in American tradition, that on page 208 includes Washington's letter to the Newport congregation as liturgy. I feel that this to me is such a key charter of the American Jewish community. It is so full of biblical allusion and a spiritual understanding of the American purpose and destiny, and we wanted to make this available as a resource for congregational use. But that final expression of why I feel this is a book of prophetic values and not of contemporary middle class values, if you will, is page 207. Another unique thing about this book is that I think this is the only preservation of a beautiful text that our late teacher Eugene Mahali composed for the bicentennial in 1976. It was used at that time, and it was used for Fred Gottschalk's inauguration, and then has never been used again until Sinai UPB introduced it, because I had kept this in my file all through the years and loved it. And as a conclusion to this session and to the entire conference, I'd like to reflect together and share this prayer on page 207. God bless this land and all its inhabitants, this land built on foundations we may call our own, pledged to law and freedom, to equality and harmony, a haven for the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, rich in opportunity, beneficiary of our talents and our devotion. And that means the talents and devotion of the Jewish community. In this hour of thanksgiving, as our hearts are overflowing with gratitude for the richness of your bounty and your favor, we humbly confess, O God, to the pride of our achievements, of our power and wealth, which all too frequently have made us arrogant. We have averted our eyes and hardened our hearts. We have been insensitive to the pain of forgotten multitudes who are excluded from the American dream. Many of our brothers and sisters, Americans all, continue to be victims of prejudice and suffer deprivation. Opportunity, equality, and justice are for them, even after 2 centuries, still only distant dreams. Help us, O God, to fulfill the promise of America. May we hold our land true to its cherished values. Renew in all of us a zeal for justice. Awaken within us compassion for the hungry and the homeless, so that we may enter upon the future with restored vision, dedicated afresh to our proud destiny. Amen. To me, that understood to be both our prayer as Jews, our prayer as Americans, and our prayer as American Jews, embodies so much of what we who cherish the classical Reformed tradition want to preserve as a vital voice within our broader movement. I hope that the Union Prayer Book Sinai edition, I hope that the work the Society is doing, I hope that the learning that we have engaged in at the feet of some of our great colleagues and teachers over the past 24 hours, I hope this will all be part of our shared journey along that road. So thank you very much, all of you, for persevering, for being with us, and I hope that our continuing partnership between the Society, between the College Institute here in Cincinnati and in Jerusalem will continue to be an important resource for all of us. Thanks very much.